And we're going to talk today about security and compliance. I talked with some of you guys ahead of the recording, so hopefully I have a good idea of where you guys want me to be headed. And the good news is I think the deck covers everything we talked about so far. So normally, when I have a tech-specific conversation, I always tell everyone, stop me whenever you want, raise your hand in the middle of my sentence, yell at me if I don't see you. This one I'm a little bit less lenient on. And the reason is, the same reason why I went around talking to you guys ahead of the session. I think I'm going to answer 99% of your questions in the course of the deck. And as such, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end. So this is one of those decks that often one slide produces 5 questions in your head. It does for me, even when I'm talking to customers on it. So if I get to the end and I still haven't answered, I will stay here as long as we need to make sure they get answered. But with that, my role is I'm kind of the middleman between the product group that writes all the stuff and puts it in the data centers and you as customers who work with our account teams in the field to make sure that you get what you need and are able to implement online successfully. So as an architect, I help them with the overall architecture to get you from where you are today to seeing how that works up in the cloud. So here's some of the questions that I wanted to start you thinking about, and I can tell from talking to you guys you've thought about a lot of them already. But these are the kinds of things I want to make sure that we cover today, because these are the typical questions that I get when I have this conversation one-on-one with individual customers. So in security, is the cloud computing secure? Is Microsoft Online Services secure? We talked about some of that right before we started the recording, and we'll talk about how we secure the data, what that means to you, what you can see to show that it's secure, because I'm sure most of you here, if not all of you, fairly technical, you'll understand what's going on the screen, but you have to be able to go back and talk to the people that aren't quite as technical, that did not come today, and explain to them how that security works. Privacy. Where is my data? Who has access to my data? Why is privacy important? So privacy is one of those terms that if I went around and asked everybody in the room, everybody have a different definition of what privacy is. For some people, it's personally identifiable data. Some people, it's only financial transactions. Some people, it's medical transactions. Some people, it's the different things that they're involved with creating a new brand, marketing, privacy. So why it's important is going to depend on what angle you're coming from, and hopefully we'll cover that. Compliance. How does Microsoft support customer compliance needs? We talked a little bit before the recording about what compliance items were important to you. And we'll talk about what we do in terms of certification and compliance and what we do for you in terms of the specific industry needs you have for you to have compliance on top of that and get to, whether it's medically specific or financially specific or what have you, based on the controls that we put in place. What certifications we hold we'll go over. What drives the need to have a continuity plan? I've been with this team a year now. Been with Microsoft 11 years. And the continuity that exists within what is BPOS today, what is Office 365, coming up here almost instantly, is kind of mind-boggling to me. Like I said, I've been with the company 11 years. I owned my own companies prior to coming to Microsoft. And even with the biggest companies I ever dealt with before coming to Microsoft, and even when I first came into Microsoft, none of that holds a candle to the multitude of data centers and the multi-millions of customers that are now in all these data centers, replicating the data back and forth in between, doing continuous replication between them to keep everything up, keeping track of the mail flow or the rights that are assigned and so forth. So the continuity plan, to me, is not only incredibly important in this ever-growing online services, but important to you as well as you write your policies and how our policies allow you to get your information where you need it to be. A formalized continuity program, recovery from a disaster event, recovery in place and exercise regularly. And we'll talk about how disaster recovery fits in with the whole security and compliance. So if we break this down into 3 different categories, security, privacy and regulatory, and service continuity, which is how the deck is laid out, one of the things that you hopefully will see is that when you look at all the different data centers that there are, that we keep track of, and how that security works, you'll see why it's so important to be able to span that over all those different data centers. To give you an idea, right now in our Dublin data center, we're bringing in about 1,000 servers a month, racking, stacking, loading the software on, getting them ready for the customers. So that security process has to be pretty well in place because they're pushing them through there pretty quick. They're putting in new modules all the time. So we'll talk about how that sets up. Privacy and regulatory. If I talk about simply somebody on-ramping onto the service, the security and getting those servers in place and setting that up for where they need to be, and the privacy and regulatory of us getting our hands back off of it so that you own all of your data and you don't have to wonder, well, what's Microsoft doing with my data? And if you still wonder, how can I find out and be sure Microsoft's not messing with my data? And then ultimately the service continuity, which is what allows you to get your certifications in place to say, hey, we're consistent, we do it this way all the time. Overall, that's our compliance management. Okay, security first. So within these layers, I talked a minute ago about how we bring the servers into the data center. So if I just take that through in a process, threat and vulnerability management, let's start at the bottom. So the facility side, you have physical controls, video surveillance, and access control. Now, one of the things that we do in our data centers is we don't advertise where we are, and we don't set up shop in the middle of town. One of the things that does is it allows us to set up a lot of this physical facility security and know when somebody's heading our way, because we're not on 5th and Main. We're out in some farm field somewhere. And so that physical facility security is very easy for us to keep up with, to set that monitoring in place, and to be able to alert us when something occurs. At the network perimeter, edge routers, firewalls, intrusion detection, and vulnerability scanning. So facility is what goes through people physically going through. The network edge is where the stuff's going through in bits and bytes. And the percentage of intrusion that takes place within a company inside the corporate network versus outside is vastly majority inside the corporate network. But now at this point, you're moving that corporate network and you're extending it out into our data center. So knowing that and preparing for that on your side within your corporate walls, and then being able to extend that out inside the network perimeter means that we need the different edge routers. Our DMZ has to be monitored, has to have alerts. I don't have it in this deck, but there's 3 basic environments in our data center. There's where all of your data is, where all of our management stuff is that keeps track of where your data is going, and then the monitoring side that alerts when something goes wrong. So, and we have different teams that are in charge of each of those. And as we go through the security compliance information on how we keep that secure, hopefully what you'll see is that we're able to take that, and each of those teams is then responsible to make sure, for instance, in intrusion detection, that if something comes through, that alert comes in, and we're able to take those measures very quickly. Before I came to Microsoft, I mentioned a minute ago, I owned a couple of my own Microsoft partner companies. Before that, I did consulting work. Before that, I did help desk work. And as I worked my way through all that over the years, one of the things that I found is that legacy environments always exist. Don't care where you are, don't care what your company is. The definition of legacy is anything that's not what you just put in and what you at some point are planning to replace. And as such, you find that Joe over there that installed this, Lotus Notes database 5 years ago, and it worked so well for the marketing group, but Joe's not with us anymore. We're pretty sure it's secure, though, because Joe was really good. Obviously, that does not work very well when it comes to verifying your security. So in that authentication that needs to take place, where those different groups within our teams have to be able to verify all that, they have to be able to verify it not only for all the different versions that are out there, because Office 365 will be out next month, but there'll still be people on BPOS Standard, there'll still be people on BPOS Dedicated, there'll still be people on BPOS Federal, and within each of those, there'll still be people that came on version 11.1, those that came on version 10.3, those that came on 10.1, 9.3, that are on their way up because they're in the upgrade path. Each of those things have to be documented and kept up with so that we can say with confidence, no matter who that customer is, no matter where they are in that upgrade process, that we know that it doesn't matter whether Joe is still with us or not, we still know it's secure because that team has taken the time and dedication to document all that stuff. Moving up to host, access control and monitoring, anti-malware, patch and config management. That's something that you and your individual companies probably have a pretty good handle on. Even if what you know of it is, hey, I need to fix this more over here or less over here, usually you're pretty up to date on where you are in terms of patching your systems and keeping up with the software side of the house. In our case, that's something that we have to be able to document and show you so that you can have the ability to go back and update your things on your side. For instance, what the Exchange server has on it may make a difference in what the client needs in order to be up to date. One of the things that we do when you install at first is we have an overall setup package that you either download or integrates in with Office Pro Plus. And once that occurs, it gets that first set of updates that prepares the desktop along with the software that you're running, whether it's Office 2007, Office 2010. As you move along, you'll need to keep updating along the lines on the desktop as well. So knowing what we've done on our side is pretty important to know where you need to be on your side. Application, secure, engineering, access control, monitoring, anti-malware. That's pretty self-explanatory. The anti-malware is typically the one that comes up most in this conversation because that's the one that gets the most press, not only with the media, but in your jobs when something occurs in your world that you have to answer for. At the user level, account management, training and awareness, and screening. So for us, let's go back to the example of racking and stacking servers and getting ready for you to put your environment together for it. Obviously, when that tech in Chicago racks that server and gets it prepared and loads the Windows operating system on it, he's got admin rights. He has full rights to that box. He may not have any idea who's going to use it, but he's got admin rights on it. So in order to follow with proper user account management, training and awareness and screening, one of the things that we have to have in our policy is, okay, well, when does he lose those rights? When does it pass on to someone who's going to load Exchange on top of that server farm as a whole? When do they lose those rights? When do your admins gain those rights that you can then go in and configure what you need to for your environment? So that's all in the user management, training, awareness, and screening. The data itself, access controls, monitoring, file data integrity. We talked a little bit about this before the session started. Things like rights management. How do you go about and set permissions on things so that you know who has access to it and who doesn't? If Sally Smith decides to go rogue and try and steal a server out of the data center, how do you ensure, A, she doesn't succeed on our end because of all these other things that are already on the screen, and B, even if she were taking it out, is it Johnny Cash, I think, stole a car one piece at a time? If your data is important and you want to make sure it doesn't leave one bit at a time, how do you do that? How do you go and put the right access controls and monitoring in place that you know without a doubt that nobody's taking it a meg at a time, a bit at a time, a drive at a time? And ultimately, overall security threat and vulnerability management, monitoring and response. Okay, so the secure development life cycle. I believe this is a building slide. Yes, it is. Back in 2002, we started the Trustworthy Computing Initiative with Bill Gates, and he came in and said that we're going to create 4 pillars of security, and we're going to set up for how that works in all the things that we do. Well, that has now gone into our data center. The security development life cycle is the result of that. This started in 2004 and continues on in our data center today. And as we go through our policies, hopefully what you'll see is education, technology and process, and accountability is shown throughout those processes, how we make sure that we keep your stuff secure and provide you the ability to manage it in the way you need to. Okay, certifications. Let's spend a few minutes on this slide, because this slide talks about not only some of the things that we talked about ahead of the session, but also probably close to a third, if not half, of all the questions that I get from customers. If you work from the bottom up, you have Microsoft has Safe Harbor as its base. Now, if you're not familiar with Safe Harbor, that's a European standard that says basically that we comply with the standards that Europe needs in order to say their data is secure. So Microsoft as a whole complies with Safe Harbor. You go up to the data center level, and you have ISO 27001 and SAS 70 Type 2. So the controls that are built out in ISO 27001, and I'm going to make this incredibly one-line simple. So for those of you that are really tight in ISO and SAS, you may say, he's leaving out a bunch. And you're right, I am. So we can talk about the bunch I'm leaving out later on if you want to. But at the core, ISO 27001 has a whole bunch of controls that we comply with, and then we show you we've complied with. And we have an FAQ that has a list of those controls and how we comply that allows you to see that. That's the core. That's the baseline of everything that we have out there. On top of that, the data centers themselves have SAS 70 Type 2. Now, if you think there's a Type 2, there's probably a Type 1, and there is. The major difference between SAS 70 Type 1 and SAS 70 Type 2 is SAS 70 Type 1 says you have to have controls in place. You have to be able to verify they're in place. SAS 70 Type 2 takes it the next step and says, oh, and by the way, they need to be good and improved upon. They need to actually work. So both are important. You need to have controls in place, and it's also really good if you know that they're good and improving. So the data center itself has gone through Type 2. And then as you go up into the services themselves that are on top of the data center, we have ISO 27001 again. And then the current BPOS-S has SAS 70 Type 1. And the current BPOS-D has SAS 70 Type 2. Now for Office 365, we also have ISO 27001. And we also have Safe Harbor. We're presently in the process of working on SAS 70 and FSMA. And the reason why we're in process now is that in both of those cases, you can't tell if something is stable unless it's not moving anymore. And as a beta environment, it moves quite a bit. So we have to wait until it goes GA before we can apply for SAS 70 and for FSMA. But those are on the roadmap. Those are coming. Data encryption at rest, something else that someone mentioned. Customer data is stored non-encrypted because when you encrypt, it impacts service functionality such as search. We'll talk in a minute how we get around some of that. Technical solutions are challenging. Identity and key management issues, policies and controls are in place to destroy, replace, and defective disks. Talked a minute ago about Sally trying to walk out with an extra disk. Well, this is one of the ways that would be difficult for Sally to do. Any disk that is defective is not set aside. It's run through the shredder, and it's destroyed. So there's no disks hanging around. Likewise, and someone asked about this before we started about encryption and how you would set rights management on it. So we'll talk about that specifically in a few slides about how that works for Exchange, how that works for SharePoint. But in general, there is a way that you can set rights management on that data, and then you can selectively say, either as an admin or as a user, that you want this data to be secure and set policies accordingly. For sensitive data, customers implement rights management. For sensitive externally sent received email, employ message encryption, which we'll talk about here in a minute for Exchange, whether it's TLS or SMIME or what have you. Enhanced email security. Require TLS for all mail between customer and partner domain in and outbound. So one of the things FOPI, Online Protection for Exchange, offers is the ability to have either opportunistic TLS or forced TLS. So opportunistic TLS says when it leaves the FOPI data center and tries to send, it should request in the handshake, can you encrypt in TLS? If the answer is yes, well, then let's take that opportunity. Encrypts in TLS, sends it over as opportunistic TLS. If they can't on the other end, well, then it sends it over as regular SMTP message. If you know, hey, if they say, no, we can't encrypt, then you don't want that message out in the open, you can put forced TLS encryption and set that in your specifications on the admin side in the FOPI admin console. So that if business partner X changes their setup and they're no longer TLS encrypted, that doesn't go unnoticed by you. The mail stops flowing. It shows up in the audit report, and then you're able to go in and get them to fix their side so that you maintain encryption all the way through. Outbound mail delivery to a smart host enables additional processing such as DLP. So let's say you have DLP on site today, and you want to move everything up to our data center, but you still want to keep your DLP solution. So what FOPI can do is it can send it, instead of directly out, it can send it back down to your DLP solution. And then your DLP solution can send it out to business partner X. So that way you can scan for whatever it is that you're normally used to scanning for and set it up that way. Optional integration with Exchange-hosted encryption. So Exchange-hosted encryption is obviously part of Microsoft because it's Exchange, but it's not specifically in the same package that you're buying with Office 365. So if you choose to get Exchange-hosted encryption, it's in essence going to have the same routing that I just described for your on-premise DLP. It's just not going to be on your premise. It's going to be on our Exchange-hosted encryption data center. And FOPI is going to send it over to there, let it encrypt, and send out. Now, the way that works, if you've never seen how EHE operates, when the message goes there, it then sends a tickler message over to the recipient. And the tickler message does not contain your message. It contains a message that says, hey, there's a message for you over here. And there's a link. And that link is encrypted, sends them back over, and then they're able to get in, log in, read the encrypted message, and that way that encrypted message never goes outside of the Microsoft data centers. It goes from Office 365 side to the EHE side, encrypted the whole way, and stays encrypted, and they come back in and get that message that way, and that way you maintain encryption all the way out. Future expanded DLP capabilities in FOPI. So there's a plan on the roadmap to provide that in FOPI at some point, so you don't have to maintain yours on-prem if you don't want to. You can simply buy DLP as an option. And then instead of FOPI rerouting back to you, it just reroutes to its DLP side and then sends out that way. Privacy. What is privacy, which we also talked about earlier? So in this case, I'm talking about personally identifiable information. Name, address, phone number, social security number. The kinds of things that make David Hayden identifiable as David Hayden. So we respect your information in the fact that we don't ever go in and see what's there. So there's never a time where we know whether you have PII data in your environment or not, because we can't see it, don't want to see it, don't want to know what's there. But you want to know what's there, and you want to know how to keep that. So we're transparent about how we gather and use PII, and what that means is that, for instance, we have PII data in your billing information. Whoever your contact is that we send the bill to, we have that PII information, and you know that. And allowing you how to direct how we use that data. So, for instance, if we have the billing data and we send you an email that says, would you like to be kept up on information for upcoming events for Office 365 or for new features for Office 365 or whatever that is. Well, the way you answer that then becomes more personally identifiable information. And so we track that and make sure you guys know how we track it and allow you to modify how much of that we have. If you decide, you know what, I don't want you to keep any of that, I don't want any of that information, just send me the bill and leave it there. So in that regard, we limit our use of PII, providing a means by which customers can update their PII to ensure accuracy. In other words, your online account allows you to go in and make those selections as you go along, so you know exactly what PII we do have access to. Striving to keep it secure, working to ensure customers can access their data. So all of your actual production data, completely out of our hands. Here in the bottom, we're talking about privacy regulations that comply while using Microsoft Online. You'll notice that in that slide I had before that talked about ISO and SAS 70 and so forth, it didn't mention any of this stuff. And the reason is because, and I'll use HIPAA as the example, Microsoft is not a medical company. We will never be HIPAA certified. Can't be, we're not a medical company. However, we can have all the controls in place and provide you with how we've gotten those controls so that you can be HIPAA certified, and as such, we can be HIPAA compliant. Our controls are compliant with what HIPAA is looking for. You look at our controls and see they're compliant with what HIPAA is looking for, and then you write your request for HIPAA. Because you as a medical company are the ones that actually care about it being HIPAA certified, HIPAA compliant, not us. Likewise, I can go down through the list, but it's all the things that you'd expect in the verticals, whether it's legal or financial or what have you. Ultimately, those are all industry-specific certifications. And what we need to be able to provide to you is how do we get to where we are so that you can look at those abundance of controls. Whenever I give this talk, it always reminds me that I answer questionnaires for customers. You know, everyone wants to know, here's the 50 pages that we always ask everyone on compliance. It's just 500 questions. It shouldn't take you long. Well, the good news in that is that 85, 90% of those are the same from every customer. The bad news is 10, 15% are not, so you got to figure out which 10, 15 those are. But by providing our controls, by giving you guys the data, you can whittle that down. You can say, okay, we don't need to ask the first 460, it's only 40 that are important, which I appreciate. Let me just say right here. But that applies in this case as well. All the individual certifications there then allow you to go in and show how that works based on what controls we've already provided to you. Global privacy regulations. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, except to say we talked before about safe harbor. EU has different sets of rules for what's considered private. Germany has even more strict restrictions than EU as a whole on what is considered private. The US has different rules than Canada. The US has the Patriot Act, which inevitably, if I'm not standing on US soil, someone asks me about, well, what about the Patriot Act? How does that apply? And it's for this reason. They're concerned that what that means is, hey, somebody's going to go take my data. But we deal with the Patriot Act the same as we do any other law. We don't want to touch your data. We don't want to know what's in it. So if anyone comes to us and says, the Acme company, we need their data, what we say is, then go talk to the Acme company. The only exception to that is if we get a subpoena that says, it's a sealed subpoena, you cannot talk to the Acme company, you must provide the data. That is the only time we ever would provide any data. Otherwise, we would always push it off back to the customer and say, we cannot. We don't know what's in there, we don't want to know what's in there.
Is that actually written into the terms of service that you won't hand it over unless it's...
I'm not sure how it's worded, but yeah, our legal guys.
We had some stuff in the Amazon cloud.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
So do you know what your policy says in that regard?
Yes, and I'll be very careful how I respond to this question. So for the sake of the recording, the question was, there are certain other competitors who will remain nameless who have a different policy than we do on how they access personally identifiable information, how they access customer data, and how willing they are to hand that over. It's one of the reasons that I go over this, because we do have a couple of fairly well-known competitors, and they do have very different rules on their aspect of how they access your data. Completely hypothetical situation. Let's say there was a commercial company who offered free email for customers, for individual users in their home. But they read that email, and they gave you targeted ads based on the email that you typed to your friend, just hypothetically. They would have to read your email in order to do that. We don't do that. We stay away from what is your personal information and leave that private. And even if it's not because we're good Samaritans, it's because there's liability reasons there. If there were, for instance, a company that did that looked at the email and sent you targeted ads, I would think that would be a potential liability concern. So we make sure in our policies that we write, go back to the same example I had before about you rack and stack the servers, you load Windows, you load Exchange, you load SharePoint, you give permissions, you hand it over to you all to do your individual stuff with it. When the migration is occurring, we keep a handful of accounts. I forget, but they're like work user 1, work user 2, et cetera. I mean, they're easily identifiable that we use for the migration itself. So you guys can see what they are. When you look at the audit, you see what those are. And then once that's done, those disappear as well. And the audit at that point, when you look at your audit report for individual things, whether that's Exchange or SharePoint or what have you, if you see whatever the name is, work user 12 in there, you have every right to raise your hand and go, hey, why is that account still there? And then we would then have to go back in and find out, why is that account there? So that we can make sure that stayed private, because we don't want to touch the data. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Actually, I have a follow-up to that question.
Yeah.
If you are operating in multiple countries,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the United States, if you receive a subpoena from another country, will you
is non-subpoenable outside of the jurisdiction of the country where the data is being stored.
Okay, so let me repeat the question. If we have a subpoena that comes from another country, but the data is stored in the U.S., would we go ahead and provide that data? Is that?
That's exactly the question.
So, don't know the answer to that one. I'll stick with I don't know. I've never seen that occur, but that's different than knowing the answer. So let me follow up on that one and find out. I do know that one of the things that we do within our system to help prevent, for instance, let me take an example, China does not allow for VoIP. So what we do within our system is we require the admin to specify what country Jane Doe is housed in. And if Jane Doe is housed in Beijing, then the VoIP rights are not available to her on the link side. Now, obviously, an admin, they could go, I'll just say she's from Chicago, and you can do that. But going back to your question, that makes the legal onus on you guys now and no longer on us because our policy says don't do that. And since we don't look at your data, we have no idea what you've done, but we do know that our policy stays within compliance for the individual countries as the laws are written. Yes?
I did some work on with the e-discovery workgroup, and I think it depends on what kind of data you're talking about, because if it's data that's of a personnel nature, and they require that to be posted and have that data over there, so we can use data.
Will Microsoft USA pull information from Microsoft Europe if they receive a subpoena? Is there reciprocity with regard to the honoring of subpoenas from different jurisdictions, which could cause a leak of intellectual property?
I will say this, because I get this question fairly frequently. Let's say a company in Germany is saying, hey, we're willing to go with Office 365, but we'll only if the data is in Dublin or Amsterdam, because we don't want it in the U.S., because we don't want to fool with the Patriot Act. That actually doesn't fix that problem since we're an American company.
Well, you're a German company and an American company and a South African company and a Chinese company.
Yep.
So which one are you when it comes to this product?
Ultimately, our headquarters are in Redmond, Washington. So ultimately, if we have data in Singapore and the U.S. requests it of us, we would go and get that data if it was by subpoena, which it pretty much answers your question. It doesn't answer the opposite side of if it's Germany asking for it from us, but it does answer it on the U.S. side where our headquarters is.
So you would not comply with a request that has less authority than a subpoena. So, for example, if the FBI comes and says, we'd like to see this, we don't have a subpoena, but we'd like to see it, they can get a subpoena.
So, but the question for the recording is, let's say someone, FBI, CIA, some government entity comes in and says, well, we don't have a subpoena, we don't have the level of subpoena, but we want access to this data. And the answer is no, we wouldn't. We would either force them to go that route or force them to go to the customer. Because there's really only two reasons why they wouldn't have a subpoena. Either A, they don't have enough evidence to get a court to give them one, and they're trying to get around that, or it's just a timing thing. If it's a timing thing, they'll fix it. If it's an evidence thing, then that'll be apparent when they go to the customer themselves.
And that's where one of your competitors has a different answer, which makes me very uncomfortable.
I understand that. All right. Government subpoenas. So, will it turn over data to U.S. companies or the U.S. government? Microsoft believes customers should control their own information. When compelled by U.S. law enforcement to produce customer records, Microsoft will first attempt to redirect them to the customer. Microsoft will notify the customer unless it cannot, because either they're unreachable or legally prohibited from doing so. Only produce records ordered by law enforcement and nothing else. Your organization is most likely already exposed to government jurisdiction. Therefore, for many companies moving to the cloud, this doesn't represent a huge increase in risk. So I can tell you I was a consultant on site with the customer who was being audited by the FDA 12 years ago. And there were hundreds of records. I was implementing a migration for them for email, which is where the bulk of the records were. And I saw a whole lot of those records show up on the nightly news later on. However, none of that occurred without a subpoena. None of that occurred without their legal side and that customer's legal side working with the FDA and saying, you must produce this by law through subpoena. So in that regard, the point of this slide is to say they weren't in the cloud. They still had to produce the same stuff as if they had been in the cloud. Data transfer. Microsoft sets the bar high across the service. We adhere to the requirements from the strictest markets like the EU Data Protection Directive, which is what I just talked about, so that we can legally store and use data in compliance with legal requirements. Microsoft offers transparency around location of customer data and tracks major international privacy laws so we know what's coming, so you're ready to address it. So let's talk about that for a moment. Because oftentimes I'll hear from customers who are concerned about this whole legal question. All right, let's say we have e-discovery that takes place and we need to know if all of our records are in Amsterdam. Can we know that? And I always say, when you need to know, I can answer that for you. But between now and then, no, I don't know. It's going to be replicated in several places. It's all going to stay in our data center. It's going to be on primary and secondary farms. But whether that's that data is just in Amsterdam or Amsterdam and Dublin or Amsterdam and Dublin and Chicago, I don't know the answer to that. So if you need to make sure that your data never moves from one location, then you can't put it in the cloud. For instance, we don't do backups. We don't have any tapes. There's no way that someone can subpoena our tapes. We don't have them. What we do instead is we replicate data. So we have continuous replication that takes place. So the positive of that is that's how our recovery time is as low as it is. And our data loss is as little as it is. The negative of that is that if you're used to using tapes and you're used to having that as, we know we have days 1 through 7 over here that we can get, and then we have off-site days 8 through 14 over here, it's a different mindset. Because now the way we do it is we have 2 different places where it occurs in this data center and 2 different places where it occurs in this data center. So if that farm fails, it rolls to that one. If that farm fails, it rolls over here. So with that, if there was a subpoena that came in that said, okay, we need all the data and where it's located, we could find where it was located when we went to get that for the subpoena. But the night before, no, I wouldn't be able to tell you where it was the night before. I'd be able to tell you where it was when we ran the track. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Replication is for a particular customer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that set to the same set of data centers, or does that randomly change?
It is to the same set of data centers. So the question was, if customer X has their data that's replicating, like I just described, do they at least know the potential places it could end up? And yes, you do know the set of data centers that you'll be within. But for instance, let's say you have FOPI that's send and mail. Well, FOPI has a data center in Canada. So your data center could be Virginia, but your email could go through FOPI in Canada on its way out. So you know that. So to your question, yes, you know where those are. But if you have email X that leaves your outbox and doesn't get to the customer and you're trying to trace back where it went, well, there's a couple different locations it could be. If you have DLP that it's rerouting to, there's a third place. If you use an exchange hosted encryption, there's another place. So there's various places where it could have ended up, but you do know what that path is. Compliance. So I've talked a lot about that bottom one there, operating procedures, and about how the various data centers that we have are working from the same operating procedures, which personally, just as a side note, I find amazing. In all the work that I did consulting and in my own personal companies before coming to Microsoft, and the customers that I worked with consulting when I first came to Microsoft, the fact that we're able to do that universally for all the data centers, I think is a testament in and of itself. Because I used to write those, and I don't like that.
An auditing of that operating procedure
Yeah, so the question is there an audit that takes place that shows that it's consistent throughout the org? And the answer is yes, in the ISO and the SAS that runs. Those are annual reports that are run. In the case of SAS 70, that's a 6-month span that they run that, and then they do a comparison and make sure that the controls are consistent. For standard system or procedural specific requirements that must be met, that goes back to the bottom one is what we do. The second one in standards is what the ISO and the SAS tell us we ought to be doing. And then the control framework, a process or system to assure the implementation is in place. And that is the mechanisms that we use to make sure that the first one and the second one match. So the procedures that we have in place to make sure that our operating procedures match the standards is the control framework, which ultimately becomes the policy, the business rule for protecting information and systems which store and process information. And our data centers are no different than anyone else's. We have people that we hire, people that leave, there's churn that takes place. So that ongoing training is very important, to be able to bring them in and know that the person that came in 3 months ago has exactly the same set of training as the person that came in 4 years ago. And that's by the policy training that we do. Addressing audit needs. So I said before that I talk about ISO and SAS, and that's probably a third or maybe a half of the conversations that I have where people are trying to make sure that our controls match their needs. Auditing is a big chunk of it as well, because we don't allow individuals to walk into our data center and do a self-audit. I probably have not had any customer over 25,000 seats who has not said to me, if we're going to go into your data center, we have to be able to get into it anytime we want. And I have to be able to explain to them, well, okay, let's say we had 20,000 customers, and each of them wanted to come in once a year. Do the math pretty quick and figure out our data centers will be full every day, 365 days a year. So we don't allow that. That is why we have third parties come in and do the ISO and the SAS 70 and the FISMA and the Safe Harbor, so that you can look at the results of those rather than you guys coming in specifically, and know that it's not just Microsoft saying, hey, I promise. There's actually more there. Deloitte & Touche comes in and does our SAS 70 audits every year. They write up the report. Any customer that's under NDA can request the results of that and see what Deloitte & Touche said about the environment. And that's how we address the audit needs. Now, one of the things we'll talk about when we get specific to the technologies here in a minute is if you're familiar with BPAWS today, you can't get to the logs very well at all, which goes back to something I mentioned right before we started the recording, and that's one of the differences between the 2007 versions of software and the 2010 versions of software is because we're a company that both is writing the software and hosting the data center, we had our programmers go in and write into the code an easier way to remotely get to auditing needs, logging needs. So now there's some self-service ways that you can go check out and make sure that David Hayden is not accessing your data. And that if John Doe was fired from the company last week, he is not coming back in and accessing the data. You can run those reports and make sure that that's a self-audit in that regard. Supporting customer compliance. Customizable and feature-rich Microsoft Online offerings to suit the customer's compliance needs. Use our features to implement your policies, retention policies, archiving, legal hold, which we'll talk in specifics about in a minute when we talk about the individual technologies. But that goes back to what I was just saying about how with the 2010 versions, which is basically the marketing name of BPAWS and the marketing name of Office 365, one of the big bucket differences between those two is 2007 server versions and 2010 server versions. And with those 2010 server versions, we provided a way for you to implement your own policies much more easily. Today, with BPAWS, most of those are implemented by calling our help desk, submitting a service request, and then one of our admins goes in and changes whatever, puts in a transport rule that says X. Now, you can go in and do your own. Yes?
One of the questions with regard to the SAS 70 and ISO 27001 is you keep mentioning a customer and look at the report. The question is, if I'm a potential customer and I want to compare the ISO 27001 and the SAS 70 level 2 reports between you and other vendors, how do I do that if I'm not currently a customer so that I can decide whether I want to be a customer?
Okay, so the question is, I talked about how a customer under NDA can go get a copy of, say, the SAS 70 if they want to. Well, what if you're trying to be a customer and you're not sure if it's the right way to go? Well, you can be under NDA and not have bought the service yet. So you can go through the process to get a non-disclosure. Yeah. So, and most of my customers do that. By the time they signed, I've had one customer, in fact, this week. It's the first customer I've had come back after they've signed and say, okay, I want a copy of that. Everybody asks when they're going through the sales process. Now, to your point, I've had to go back to at least half those customers and go, you told me you had an NDA, but you really don't. So, which probably innocent on their part. Jane told Sally, told Fred, told Bob, oh yeah, we have NDA with them. You know, it's a common thing. And likewise on our side. We have a site internal to us now where I can go and type in the company. It tells me when they had it, if they have an NDA and what date they got it. I've been in the company 11 years. I only found out about that site 2 years ago. So it was a whole long time where on our side we kind of said, oh, okay, as long as they promise, we'll take their word for it, which obviously is not good on the legal side for either. But you can do that before you purchase.
As a follow-up to that question, for my auditors, do my auditors have access to that same information?
Auditors as in like a third party?
Right, at Deloitte or at KPMG or other third-party auditors that come in, or, for example, an inspector general with regard to a federal agency, do they have the ability to get to that same report to evaluate it as part of my compliance framework?
Not unless they have an NDA with us as well. So, for instance, you mentioned Deloitte. They have an NDA with us. In fact, they're the ones that wrote it. But if they... Yeah, but still under NDA. Still Deloitte would be under NDA. But if they don't, then no, they wouldn't be able to review. Because at the end of the day, when someone comes up to me and says, hi, I'm Bob with Contoso, I'm thinking of buying, I've got an NDA, I want to see the report. I have no idea if he's really looking to buy. But I know under NDA, I've fulfilled the legal side that says, hey, he's not supposed to share that with anybody. Service continuity. So this framework kind of goes back to what I said a minute ago, where I said, you know, we have some people in our data center who have been there 3 months and some people that have been there 3 or 4 years. And part of what allows us to have that seamless transition, to know that those that are trained 3 months into it and those that are trained 3 years into it, is this service continuity program framework. So part of our training that we do with those that are both on the phone side, the customer help desk side, as well as the technical side in the data center, is to make sure that they understand how this works. Based on the continuity industry best practices, provides a standardized approach across the enterprise, consistent and sustainable processes, focusing on internal core competencies, identifies impacts, dependencies, and gaps, implement solutions and plans for remediation, exercises on a regular basis to ensure processes are operating as intended, meet established RTOs and RPOs. So I talked about RTOs and RPOs a minute ago about the fact that because we have this standard continuity framework, that's what allows us to do the replication, to maintain short time between failure and small amounts of data, if any, lost when that occurs. Continuity concerns. What drives the need to have a continuity plan in place to protect the customer and the service from any major outage? So the bigger answer to that is that continuity plan goes back to what we said a minute ago, which allows us to know and you to know that if you run an exchange in data center A and something goes wrong and it moves over to data center B, it's going to be the same implementation because of that continuity framework that we have across the data centers. We do DR testing every year. We talk about the results of that every year. But I'm very proud to say it's always gone well because of this continuity concerns that framework that we have in place. I can also say that in my previous lives, when I've done DR tests with customers, they have been disastrous. And not because anything was wrong with the customer, just because it's really hard to make sure that the processes at data center A and the processes at data center B match. So the fact that we're hitting that on stride, I think, is a real good plus for us. Does Microsoft have a formalized continuity program in place? Yes. I don't need to go into detail on that. Does each service have the ability to recover from a disastrous event? Yes. There are different RTO and RPO times, depending upon whether you're talking about Lync, Exchange, SharePoint, but they're all listed in the service descriptions. Has anyone in here read the service descriptions for BPAWS or Office 365 before? Okay. So I would definitely encourage you to. If you just go out to Bing and type in Office 365 service description, it'll come up. There's a whole slew of them. There's one specific to Exchange, one specific to SharePoint, to Lync, to support, to operations, to SLAs. And within each of those, for Exchange, Lync, and SharePoint, there'll be information on RTO, RPO, and how the continuity framework applies in that instance. So every time I go to a customer, the first question, the second question, the 13th question, the 50th question, and the 110th question I ask is always, have you read the service description? And the reason is because we labor over those things in minute detail. And typically, 90-95% of the questions are found in one of those pages. And they're not too big. The Exchange one's 40 pages or so. The SharePoint one's about the same. Lync's a little shorter. But they're not that difficult. But they just have a wealth of information on what do you need on your side, what does it look like on our side, how long does it take to recover if in case of a disaster, what are the limitations in terms of how much email you can send, how big your messages can be, how many people you can have before you move from small business to enterprise. All those things are all in there. So definitely encourage you to go out and take a look at those, read them to your children at night, save them for posterity. Is the plan exercise tested on a regular basis? Yes. As I just mentioned, we do DR testing annually. Office 365 specific. So with Exchange Online, we have retention tags. So say, for instance, you want to give your users the ability to go in and save a message for the next 10 years. Well, you can go in, right-click on it, and set a policy that has been preset by you that says, move this into the 10-year bin so that it doesn't get purged out. Likewise, you could go the opposite direction and say messages that are like this, have a retention policy of 30 days, and have them set it. We'll get down here in a minute to mail tips, but mail tips work that way as well on a personnel level. So say you're sending email to the Acme company, and you want to talk about the latest, greatest marketing campaign that's top secret, nobody should hear about. Well, if the keyword for the marketing campaign is widget, and widget shows up there, it'd be great if there's a mail tip that came up that said, caution, you're sending an email about widget to an external recipient. That's against policy. Much like what we just talked about in personally identifiable information, when we say to a customer, if they're in China, they can't have VoIP, and the customer decides then for themselves whether or not they actually write China, we've done our part. Likewise, the mail tip's the same way. So the mail tip says, hey, widget shouldn't be talked about outside the company. You're now putting the onus back on that individual user to decide whether or not they're going to go ahead and send that email or not, but they will know whether or not it's in policy or not. So mail tips are, I think, a real good way. I did a lot of training in my previous life. And I find that the vast majority of mistakes that take place inside a company are because of sneakernet and gossip. Because of what I just said about NDA. Well, if Bob told Fred, told Sally, told Jim, well, then doesn't that mean it's true? And mail tips are a great way to get around that so that people know what the actual policy is. But I jumped down. Personal archive. So one of the nice things about personal archive is that it's personal. The person can slice and dice their mailbox the way they want to and move stuff either in their mailbox or in their personal archive. Now, the biggest difference they're going to see is that personal archive does not go into the offline store, the OST file. So if they're on a plane, they're not going to have what's in the personal archive. They're going to have what's in their mailbox. What's good about that for this conversation is there's some information you probably don't want them to have on a plane. That top secret widget thing that you don't want to go outside the company would be a great thing for them to keep in their archives. That they can only access it when they're physically connected to the mailbox. Multi-mailbox search. We talked a while back now. We'll talk about that in a minute. Multi-mailbox search. So one of the things that you can do now is, as an admin, you can go in and take a whole group of mailboxes and search for whatever. We'll use widget again. and get that all in one fell swoop. Litigation hold. So let's say you put John Doe on litigation hold and you want their mail to stay. John Doe can still delete mail in his mailbox, and it disappears from his mailbox. But all that really happens is it becomes hidden and still stays available to you because the mailbox is on litigation hold. And you can do litigation hold either with or without notification. So you can either let John know that he's on it or not let John know that he's on it. Journaling for integration with external archive services. So you can write things off through a journal stream, off to some external archiving solution that allows you then to do whatever specific thing you're doing. So say you have an on-premise solution now that does archiving. And you've got 176 terabytes of data in there. And you got a choice. You could spend the time and money to move it, which might be worth it to you, or just leave it, because it's only a 12-month hold anyway, so you know that if you just let it attrition over the course of the next 12 months, it's ultimately going to have 0 in it 12 months from now, and then you don't have to pay a dime. I've seen customers do it both ways. But because you can journal, you can have that choice. You can continue to journal stuff off there if you want to keep it going and live. You can not journal and just leave it as a separate if you want it to attrition and die off. Or you can go ahead and make the move and move it over to put everything in personal archives and mailboxes. Rights management support, decrypt to journal. So what I was starting to say a minute ago and held off was a multi-mailbox search with the present BPAWS. That's a problem if anything has encryption, because you can't get to it. Nothing that would be encrypted would show up in the search. So with this, you can decrypt the journal. So if you've got John, Sally, Fred, Bob that are being pulled off because the multi-mailbox search said, hey, they've got some stuff that needs e-discovery, then what you can do is take their stuff and decrypt it to journal. Now, there's a catch there. As with all security, it's as secure as you define it to be. So in this case, in order to decrypt the journal, you would have to be able to share your keys on our side onto the server. May not be something you want to do. You may not trust us. You may decide, I don't want to give my keys to a server that someone else could potentially get to. Fine? But the other side of that is then you can't decrypt the journal. You can still journal, but you'd have to decrypt it on your own through a supervisory key afterward, and not during the search and retrieval process. SMIME support, that goes back to encrypting email as it's exiting. We just talked about mail tips, transport rules. So today, I mentioned several times already that in BPAWS today, most of the rules that take place because you call our help desk and say, I want to open a SR, I want to change X to Y. With this, now that we've changed a lot of the code, a lot of that can be done either through Exchange Control Panel, which is part of the admin side of OWA, if you're not familiar with what Exchange Control Panel looks like, or through PowerShell. Remote PowerShell is very big in Office 365 because we've revamped the code to allow that. Filtering, disclaimers. Let's say you want to filter based on widget, and you wanted to make sure that mail was flagged. You can do that. Disclaimers to add on a supervision and ethical wall. So say you wanted to make sure that the R&D team cannot talk to the marketing team because all of their super secret stuff should not be published. You can do that with an ethical wall. Antivirus and spam using FOPI. That's built in. Again, you can probably tell in the course of this conversation, I've been in this industry for quite a few years. The FOPI admin guide is far more impressive than anything I have seen in terms of what has ever been offered, anything that I have worked with before in terms of antivirus, anti-spam, custom rules, custom groups, etc. So very robust in how you can set individual allows and blocks based on destination or domain or user or group or what have you, filtered words. Role-based access control. So with, again, the present environment that we have with BPAWS, one of the things that we have is you can be an admin, or you can not be an admin. For some odd reason, some customers would like something in between. So For this, we have role-based access support, where you can give people roles to specifically what they're working on, much like Exchange 2010 offers on-premise. Audit reports, which we talked about a minute ago. So non-owner access report. That was the report I was mentioning a little bit ago that said if you want to make sure David Hayden is not touching your stuff, you can, at your leisure, run a non-owner access report and find out if someone got into a mailbox that they did not own. Now, if you have any organization of size, you're going to have something in there because someone's administrative assistant has access to this, or someone is getting into a conference room mailbox because they're updating whatever. I mean, there's some legitimate reasons why people should show up in that report. But the purpose of running it is to make sure that the only people that show up in that report are legitimate reasons. Admin configuration change report. Again, that's something that's now available to you and you don't have to ask us for. And that allows you to see if one of your friends on the team decided that the policy you put in last week was not really what they wanted and they'd like to change it. So you can run that and find out if someone has changed an admin configuration. SharePoint. So information management policy for expiration and audit policies. So expiration, let's say you have a document library that you want to expire in 9 months. You can set that expiration on the document library and then it will expire in 9 months. The audit policy, you can see who has accessed it and what they've done with it. I find that helpful not only to police it, but also simply for productivity reasons. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've created a SharePoint site and put some files up there and then wondered, I wonder who's accessing this. I wonder if it's useful. I wonder if we should change this. Well, if you go and audit, you can find out how it's being used. Business taxonomies and tagging. So we support a taxonomy term store that you can then reuse for the sites based on content type. And that way you can set that term store up and reuse within each of those sites and not have to go back and repeat that every time. Document sets and IDs. So I am a belt and suspenders kind of guy. When you look at my document repositories, usually it says widget version 1, widget version 2, widget version 3, widget version 3B, widget version 3B 1A 2C, because I changed something and I want to make sure I keep the change. Well, you don't need to do that. That is David not getting into the 21st century and remembering all the years past when I had things on file servers and had to keep track of all the changes. Well, with this, document set and IDs, that takes it one step further. Not only do you not need to do that because you can have version control in there, but you can also attach metadata to it. If it's called standard widget implementation, V1, well, maybe that's not enough information. Maybe you want to add metadata to that says what document set that belongs to. That's for the Acme company. And the ID is it's for the Acme company Exchange rollout. And it's for phase 2. And it's for Eastern Europe or whatever. You can build into that metadata that can then sort in there, that can then be searched on from there. And most importantly, in searching for it, you can find it. Because let's say, whatever I just said, the Eastern Europe exchange phase moved, and now it's the North American one, and so all those documents got moved over. All that metadata is still there. So I can still search on the same document sets and IDs that I always have, and I should still get it, regardless of where it ended up in the sites, as long as I know what the document sets and IDs are. So it's a lot more handy than just having a document file name to look for. Document level access control. If you're familiar with the older versions of SharePoint, you know it didn't used to be document level access. It was site level, folder level, etc. Now SharePoint offers document level. Now SharePoint Online offers document level access control. So you can set permissions based on individual items that are in it. Site collection, site level audit reports. So content activity, information management policy, and security and site settings reports. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. But they go back to what I was talking about at the top of the slide there, where by getting these reports and seeing what activity is taking place, what policies are applied to that site, and what security settings are in that site, you can do a couple of things. One, you can keep track of the things that I was talking about before about productivity and who's using it and how they're using it and so forth. But likewise, you can then duplicate that effort elsewhere. If you can run a report that says this is set up this way over here, well, then you can use that report to set it up this way over here. And no, getting back to the continuity that we talked about in general for this session and all the different data centers we have, well, maybe we want to do the same thing for a site. We want to set everything is set the same. And likewise, the example I gave a while back about Joe, the Lotus Notes developer who built something 5 years ago, but we can't find Joe anymore. Well, this puts it all in for posterity's sake. If someone wants to know how it was built and what all the settings were, well, you run a report and you save it. So that you can keep track of, this is how we set it up, this is why we set it up, and this is how we're going to set it up 6 months from now when we do it again over here. Yeah?
In the area of audit, one of the issues that seems to be not addressed, maybe you can answer this, is real-time event reporting, such as integration with SIEM systems.
Mm-hmm.
To do real-time reporting and for analysis of threats and real-time response to threats. What is the nature of Office 365 with regard to real-time alerting, and what is available for real-time alerting and integration with third-party SIMs?
So if I could summarize that question is, how does Office 365 provide for real-time reporting when events take place that you want to be alerted for? So for your side, there's not a whole lot there. For our monitoring side, we have alerts that come up, and we have what's called a health dashboard. So we have a bunch of alerts that are set for activity and queuing and delays and things like that on our side, and then we have a health dashboard that you see. And that health dashboard is at first very basic, green, yellow, red. And if you highlight one that's yellow, you can click on it, and then it takes that next level of detail and tells you why it's yellow. This queue is backed up in this area. It was first identified here. It's being looked at. Update will appear in this amount of time.
The second follow-up question is the question of exfiltration, and that is what mechanisms are built into this to minimize mass exfiltration of data out of the system in case of compromise.
Don't know the answer to that one. So for the recording, the question was what's put in place in order to keep from exfiltration and data to be extracted back out if you don't want it to be extracted back out. In mass.
Bulk extract,
Yeah.
i.e. Sony
Yeah.
type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so all of that is audited. I mean, none of it would go unnoticed, but I don't know of anything that says, and if it occurs, stop it. So, for instance, I was on a SharePoint site this morning or last night for one of our internal product groups. And I had a document that I was going for, and I saw another one that I knew I needed, but I also knew that they hadn't sent it to me yet. But I knew if I went and got it, it would show up on the audit report, so I didn't go get it. What I did instead was I wrote the owner and said, hey, just want to check back and see how that document's coming along, because I happen to see that it's sitting on the folder. I want to go get it. So it always shows up in the audit, always lets you see what's there. But I don't know of anything that says, and if people start to remove it, then stop them. There's no throttling setting that I'm familiar with. Okay. In-place records management. Records declaration and litigation hold. So you can mark something as a record. You can mark something to be held for litigation. The one thing that you can do with SharePoint on-prem that's not in this yet is to automatically offload an archive. You know, in records management, you can't right now in records management go in and say once it reaches this threshold, then do this movement with it. So, but other than that, that's the same thing right there that you have in SharePoint 2010 on-prem. Yes.
Something you declare a record automatically based on the metadata that you went to select.
So the question is, can you have something be declared as a record automatically based on what metadata you put in it when you put it in? And yes, you should be able to set that and then have it be set as it comes in. All right. Lo and behold, I did that almost right on time. So normally here I'd have listings for all the other sessions you should attend while you're here. However, seeing as how this is the last session, there's nothing like that. But these are several links that I would recommend to you. The top one there probably has the link to it for the server subscriptions that I mentioned, so I would encourage you to go find those. The middle one there, I believe, is where you would go if you have not already signed up for the Office 365 beta. I would highly encourage it. In fact, I'd encourage you to do it two ways. When you sign up, it says, are you a small business with 25 or less users, or are you a big business? Call yourself, I am the Acme Small, .microsoftonline.com. I am the Acme Big.microsoftonline.com. And look at both of them. We don't have time to get into all the differences, but one of the differences is how authentication takes place, either directly through your AD or simply through its own sign-on. And the other major difference is pricing. The left-hand side for 25 or less is $6 a month, all you can eat for Exchange, Lync, SharePoint. The other side is a la carte. Do you just want Lync? Do you just want Exchange? Do you just want SharePoint? Are you going to be connecting through ADFS and DirSync? Do you want archiving, et cetera? So I'd encourage you to go sign up for those and take a look at that. Questions? Yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions is on one of the first slides you had, it talked about multi-factor authentication.
Uh-huh.
And what sort of multi-factor authentication is provided?
Okay. So multi-factor authentication is available in Exchange OA today, and is available for SharePoint, I believe, in the fall. So that would then, I'm trying to remember which.
What kind of multi?
I'm trying to remember what the name is, which is what you're looking for, and I don't recall off the top of my head, but it's in the server subscription.
I mean, is it Oath? Is it Smart Card? The other question is with regard to certificate authority and certificates. What is the plan with regard to encryption to support private certificates as well as other certificate authorities so that the encryption would be private to the company so that our traffic would be non-decryptable by another organization?
Well, for instance, if you're using RMS, it's going to be based on a rights management server within AD, and all those certs are going to be whatever you've set them for. So if they're specific to you, then they don't need to be a public cert.
So we can provide the certificates for all of the components?
Yes.
The next question has to do with add-ons. We use a lot of add-ons for Exchange, and we also use add-ons for things like Word and other components of Office.
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of third parties in terms of using their add-ons into this environment, and what is the ecosystem for ISVs in this arena? So
a couple of things there. A lot of times I'll use like fax software as a typical one. That's an add-on. We don't allow for API integration for fax software, but we do allow for SMTP integration for fax software. So oftentimes companies have to go and exchange the API-based fax software that they have for the SMTP-based software that they have. The general rule is if it requires admin changes on the box, it's not going to happen. If it doesn't require admin changes on the box, it's likely possible. So, for instance, in the migrations that you do, a lot of the migration software requires APIs directly on the server. So the migrations that we do does not require those APIs directly on the server, because in this case, a server farm represents not simply one customer, but a whole group of them.
So is there an app market for add-ons for Excel, for Word, for all of the different Office components where third parties can, like in, say, in Salesforce, where you can subscribe to trusted third parties that can extend out the Office 365 capability?
I'm trying to think of an example of one, because certainly within the desktop applications, you can, but if you're talking about the integration with, say, data back on the SharePoint server.
Well, I'll give you an example. Let's
Okay.
say in Exchange we use Exclaimer, which puts signatures on our emails.
Okay.
How would we do that inside of this environment?
Likely that would not work, because it would need access to the server itself in order to do it. Other questions? All right. If you're sticking around, there'll be a party tonight, I think 9 o'clock.